and welcome to the GreenTruth podcast by TiiQu, your go-to destination for insightful conversations on sustainability. We're committed to delving into diverse perspectives on environmental issues, guided by the belief that embracing truth empowers us to create a better world for generations to come. I'm Chantal Kerr-Shepherd, your host, and today I'm joined by Paul Ekins, an environmental economist and Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at University College London. He's also worked for over 40 years in the field of environment resources. So Paul, thank you for being with us here today.
My pleasure.
So you've consulted for big business, for government, international organisations. So you must have a pretty good idea of what environmental sustainability is in the context of today's global challenges.
Yes, I've certainly looked into the concept in depth, and the one thing I've learned about it is that people use it with very different meanings. To some extent, it's kind of become a non-word in that it can mean anything that anyone wants it to mean. When I use it, I mean something quite specific by it, which is that environmental sustainability is the ability of the planet to go on providing the huge range of what economists call environmental goods and services, on which we are absolutely dependent. And these range from the really big things like sustaining the biosphere through biodiversity and regulating the climate so that we have a habitable planet, right the way down to providing clean air and cleaning up the air with trees, to providing clean water, and the whole host of recreational and other benefits that give people huge pleasure, cultural benefits, and spiritual insights very often. So it's quite clear that the ability of the planet to do those things is currently under very considerable threat. And the scientific evidence on that is completely unequivocal. And it's up to humans to stop doing some things and to do lots of other things that will actually get us back into stability with the natural world, to enable the natural world to go on doing the things for us that it does.
And what things do you think we need to start doing?
Well, the most obvious thing we need to stop doing is using fossil fuels. And at the last conference of the parties, at the climate summit, there was a huge debate as whether we need to phase them out or phase them down. I mean, all that is just semantics. They've clearly got to be phased out, and we've got to stop putting these emissions in the atmosphere. And because we need energy, that means we're going to have to get our energy from a range of other sources. The good news is that the renewables revolution is accelerating away much more quickly than people thought. Most recently, the data was that 30% of global electricity is now coming from zero carbon sources.
Amazing.
In the UK, it's even higher. It's well over 50%. And on some days, we don't use fossil fuels at all. And that's an enormous achievement for an economy that was built on fossil fuels. But to get that going globally is still a huge challenge. And we've got to see further progress.
And you say fossil fuels need to be completely eliminated. Obviously, to you and I, that's because we need to reduce the amount of carbon that's being produced. Do you think fossil fuels is the one and only problem, or do you think there are others we need to address too?
No, fossil fuels are about 3/4 of the problem. So they're an absolutely essential place to start. But the other quarter broadly is the way we use land, and particularly the way we produce food. That's a different greenhouse gas, in that from fossil fuels we mainly get carbon dioxide, but also some methane from fossil natural gas. But methane is also produced when we grow rice, and particularly when we cultivate animals, and particularly sheep and cows through their digestive systems. So we need to address that. People who eat too much meat, and broadly that's the rich world, need to eat less. That doesn't mean we don't need to eat any. In the scenarios of the Climate Change Committee in the UK, they suggest that we could get on track for what they call net zero by 2050, which is where broadly the emissions are balanced by the removals from the atmosphere, we should cut meat consumption by about 30%. And I wasn't a vegetarian. I'm still not a vegetarian. I enjoy eating meat, but I've cut my meat consumption by about 50%. And that's probably good for me, actually, good for me in terms of health. And of course, I eat less of it. I appreciate it more. So, um, obviously, bully for those who want to go the full vegetarian and vegan routes, because that is making an even bigger contribution to the solution. But it's not strictly necessary for us all to do that.
So you talk about reducing what we're doing and changing what we're doing. Is this an issue of behaviour change? Is it to do with, I know in your book, Stopping Climate Change, you talk about consumption being a problem?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, obviously, consumption is at the root of it, but consumption is not purely an individual choice. We're constrained in what we consume and how we consume enormously by both the social norms, the habits, and everything in the societies in which we live, but particularly also infrastructures. Um, so that, for example, if you currently live in rural areas in the UK, it's enormously difficult to get around without a car. Um, and obviously, the move towards electric vehicles, which is also something that's accelerating away, will enable us to get about um, uh, without producing CO2 emissions. But batteries that drive these cars, they depend on digging up various minerals from different parts of the world. Mining can also be environmentally problematic. So undoubtedly, it would be good if we could reduce our car population. But in order to do that, we're going to have much better transport and public transport services than we currently have. And in cities, we can see a city like London, where I'm privileged to live, has terrific public transport services. There's absolutely no reason why an able-bodied person in London needs a car. For those occasional journeys when you may want to be transporting something heavy, there are car clubs you can hire by the hour. Otherwise, it's completely unnecessary. I've lived without owning a car in London since 1980, and I'm hardly a deprived individual. You can walk, you can cycle. It all becomes much more pleasant if there's less traffic out there.
The
And
lovely little cargo bikes I've seen about, lots of people using them
well,
in.
indeed, absolutely. And I used to carry my son when he was small around on a bike with a third wheel on the back, which you've probably also seen. Cargo bikes weren't so common in those days, so that's perfectly possible. And many cities in Europe are moving in that direction. And we've seen most recently in the London elections that the efforts of the current mayor to push clean air, to push the climate agenda, seems to have been well rewarded in the election, so that he won a third term.
So do you think it's at the kind of macro level that these changes need to be made? So government policy to help with infrastructure, to change behaviour, to adjust our social norms and our expectations?
Absolutely. That, in a way, that comes first, because it's simply unrealistic to expect people to change their individual behaviors when they're living in a social context where that is actually extremely difficult, extremely inconvenient, um, and would result in them having to adopt a lifestyle which frankly is completely out of kilter with social norms. But having said that, and therefore the importance of government policy doesn't appear out of the ether. Government policy appears because citizens demand it. They demand that their politicians do these things, and they punish them when they don't. And I think, for example, that it's been extremely damaging to the current government in the UK to go on licensing North Sea oil and gas. People don't want governments to do that. People want governments to get on with the renewables revolution and to help the country decarbonise. Then they're prepared to do their bit. And they are doing their bit. And we've seen um, CO2 emissions fall in this country. But obviously, harking back to the fossil fuel era isn't helpful with that, because it sends confused messages to people they're not quite sure what government wants. And obviously, they begin to think, well, oh, perhaps it's not as serious as it actually is. Um, so we start with citizens making sure governments do their bit. And then, and that means local governments, obviously, and city governments, as well as national government. And then consumers and citizens will find it easier to shift their lifestyles um, in a way which will actually make them healthier. Um, and we get a completely different kind of industrial infrastructure. We get different sorts of jobs. Instead of plumbers and gas fitters installing gas boilers, they're installing heat pumps. We're manufacturing heat pumps. So you're getting a new industrial revolution, which obviously can give us economic benefits as well.
So you think that decarbonising, changing to renewables, and reducing our consumption of red meat can be a positive economic impact, and it can be a good thing, and our lives can change for the better?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge, and these transitions are disruptive. And it means that people in settled jobs uh, need to retrain. They may need completely different jobs, so that the northeast of Scotland, for example, which is currently heavily dependent on oil and gas, could become the hub of offshore wind, and in a way is becoming the hub of offshore wind. Um, but that does mean that some jobs will be lost, that some people will need to retrain, that the jobs will be different. None of this is easy for people, and one has to understand that. And that's the other way in which governments need to help, that they don't just pull the plug on whole sectors of the economy and expect people to adjust by themselves in a way that happened when we shut down the coal industry
Yeah.
effectively in the 1980s in this country, with enormous social disruption and hardship to the communities involved, that governments need to get involved to make sure that the alternative jobs are available, make sure the alternative skills training is available, and need to instigate what is sometimes called the just transition. And we can see right round the country all sorts of examples where that needs to take place. Most recently, of course, Tata Steel in Port Talbot in South Wales is closing down its blast furnaces. It has to do that. It's losing shed loads of money for that. It's going to put in a much cleaner form of steel production through electric arc furnaces. But there will be definitely huge scope for government help to help those people who are going to lose those jobs in South Wales to diversify into other industries beyond steel. And perhaps in the longer term, Tata will then invest in clean steel production from scratch using hydrogen, which is what's happening in Sweden at the moment. That is going to be the future. And that, of course, will create a whole new steel industry, which will be more or less completely carbon free. And we'll find that that is going to be the basis on which we get steel in the future.
That's a really good outlook of how an industry can change. It's a really good example of positive change. Are there any specific kind of policy interventions that balance that social well-being and the transition to a greener industry that can promote the changes to happen faster?
Well, policy interventions are absolutely key. So we've got the three big areas that I've been talking about. So we've got industry, and the steel example is that. That's not the only one. We're going to have to sort out the plastics industry. We're going to have to find other sources of the sorts of services that plastics give us. Plastics are unbelievably useful in all sorts of ways, but they are a major source of unsustainability, not just because when we burn them they emit they emit CO2, but because they clog up the oceans. And we're seeing this um, uh, enormous expanse of ocean plastic all over the place. There's microplastics absolutely everywhere in our food, in our bloodstream, and everything. And it's unlikely that that's doing us a lot of good. Um, so there's an industrial transformation that's necessary. There's an agricultural transformation that's necessary. It's a huge challenge to continue to produce as much food as we need with a continuing growing global population while doing so in a way that it is much less destructive of the environment. Some 90% of biodiversity loss comes from agriculture globally. And there are forms of agriculture which will balance the need for nature conservation with large-scale food production. But at the moment, we're not doing them on anything like the required scale. So that will require huge policy. We've talked about the decarbonisation of the electricity system. That is a huge policy success in the UK. We've moved towards offshore wind, certain amount of onshore wind, and particularly photovoltaics everywhere. There's much more we can do with that. Particularly, we could put photovoltaics on our roofs to a much greater extent. And then, of course, there's the transport sector, where we need to shift to electric vehicles and to public transport. And again, that's a function of infrastructure. We need battery factories in order to make the batteries for the electric vehicles. Our car manufacturers need to shift from internal combustion engines to the creation of electric vehicles. All this is new activity and is new jobs, but as I've said, it's a transition. It could be disruptive, and government has a huge role in order to smooth out those disruptions.
Why do you think some industries are accelerating faster than others? So you've mentioned renewables have come leaps and bounds, but agriculture is way behind.
Well, partly because we started with renewables and the focus on agriculture has been relatively recent. So we've not actually tried to do very much in agriculture. In a way, that's justified because, as I've said, the fossil fuels were responsible for some 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions. But this final quarter is going to be really important. And of course, the biodiversity, the whole nature agenda has risen up in profile over recent years. And so agriculture's role in destroying nature, as well as uh, contributing to the global warming, has become much more apparent. So that's why agriculture is getting more attention now. Obviously, food production is absolutely critical, and we can't uh, stop producing very large quantities of food and getting agriculture to change. There are farmers who are doing it successfully. There's the Nature Friendly Farming Network around the country in the UK. And speaking to those farmers, which I'm privileged to have done, they make a living, but they also contribute very greatly to nature conservation on their farms. And that needs to become the dominant way of farming. And governments need to give incentives to help farmers to shift. Again, like all these changes, it's not straightforward, it's not easy, it requires huge skills, it requires different skills. And farmers are like all of us, they need to make a living. Um, and they like to do what they know how to do. And change can be difficult.
And those incentives you talk about, what do they kind of look like?
Well, we had when the post-Brexit government in 2016, we had an opportunity to move away from the European Union's common agricultural policy, and the then Environment Secretary came up with this idea of public money for public goods, that farmers would continue to be subsidized, but they would not be subsidized simply on the basis of how much land they owned, which was the European Union's basis of subsidy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it was the large landowners who got most of those subsidies.
Rather than on production.
Uh, it used to be on the basis of production. Back in the 1980s, you remember there were phrases like wine lakes and butter mountains, because farmers were subsidized to increase production. And of course, they did that way beyond what the market could absorb. And so they overproduced. And this overproduction created huge problems by being dumped in third world countries where it gave urban populations cheap food. But of course, it undermined the agriculture in those countries enormously.
Ah,
So the European Union shifted away from that largely to income support, and income support on the basis of how much land you farmed rather than on the basis of how much you produced. And that was beneficial because it reduced some of the worst examples of intensive production. But it didn't do much for the environment, although there were a few agri-environment schemes. And the UK government said, right, we're going to use some of our Brexit freedom in order to subsidize the production of environmental goods and services from farmers. Now, that's proved to be a very complicated and difficult process, as I suppose was imaginable, and the farmers are pretty upset with the way a lot of it has worked out. But that is definitely the right way to go, in my view. And we need to sort out, we need to sort it out better. It's not surprising that it's proved difficult because a subsidy system on the basis of nature conservation is not easy, because actually getting the right measures, getting the right indicators for how you need to be doing that is not something we had any experience with. And there are nearly always teething troubles with that kind of change. But I think that's absolutely the direction in which we need to go. And we need to learn from the mistakes. And we need to make sure that farmers can earn a decent living. And I mean small farmers as well as big farmers, by looking after nature as well as producing food.
Absolutely. Do you think that's applicable to other industry as well? The incentive-driven change?
Well, absolutely. And that's how we've got to where we've got to with renewables, that it wasn't a question so much of subsidy there in the later stages, although initially there were large subsidies going to offshore wind production. But that brought down the cost to such an extent that offshore wind is now more or less competitive with fossil fuel generation.
And without the subsidies?
Yeah, without subsidy. It doesn't need subsidy. What it does need is a secure market, because it's a much more capital intensive. So you need far more investment up front in order to create an offshore wind farm. And then, of course, you don't have any fuel to buy. So the fuel cost is effectively zero. You've just got very low maintenance costs. But those very large capital expenditures are risky. And so the mechanism that we have in the UK, which is to guarantee that these offshore wind farms will be able to sell their electricity at a certain price, which is what the Contracts for Difference policy mechanism ensures, that reduces both the risk and the cost of the capital borrowing that is required to build them in the first place. So you're getting cheaper electricity, but you're having to guarantee a market in order to reduce those capital costs and risks up front. And it's that sort of policy mechanism which has been a huge success and which we need to embrace, I think, in other sectors as well.
But it sounds to me like all it needs is some initial investment to incentivize different industries to make the change, to look at innovation. And then once it's set up, you've created a new market, and then you need to change the social norms around it to demand it. And then it should be stable and then economically viable.
That has been the experience, certainly with offshore wind, certainly with photovoltaics, certainly with batteries, that they start off expensive. And photovoltaic panels, they used to be eye-wateringly expensive. I'm thinking back to the 1980s. And then once you start building them at scale and you start rolling them out at scale, and China has been really important in that process with photovoltaics, then what economists call learning by doing happens. And that's basically the innovation that we all experience. When we start doing something, we don't do it terribly well. But once we get experience at doing it, we improve and we find all little ways of doing it better and better. And the costs come down. And that's what's happened with renewable technologies. It's happened with batteries. It's certainly happened with happening with electric vehicles, so that people are now reckoning that electric vehicles will cost no more than internal combustion engines during the course of this decade. So that once you go through that transition, then yes, you're able to do what you want to do at no higher cost than you were doing before, but at hugely improved environmental performance. So no CO2 emissions, no greenhouse gas emissions. So we've done that for renewables. We're doing it for electric vehicles. We now need to do it for agriculture. And of course, the other big sector is our buildings. And the building stock in the UK is extremely inefficient. It takes a lot of gas, mainly gas, to heat those buildings. And we need to bring them up to scratch and find a different heating source, which for many buildings will be heat pumps, so that they use zero carbon electricity instead of using fossil fuels.
So do you think it's just a matter of moving some money and having a little bit of faith in a better world that we can build?
Well, that's a nice way to put it. Um, I mean, moving the money is the title of various lectures that I give around, and it's obviously incredibly important. But money doesn't move by itself. Money tends to move where it can make more money,
Yeah.
and so finding the right policy incentives so that the money will move, so that it can make more money while doing the right things instead of making money by doing the wrong things. And that's where the fossil fuel industry is so detrimental at the moment, because at the moment the fossil fuel industry is making so much money out of fossil fuels that it doesn't want to shift to other forms of energy anything like as fast as it needs to. And so that's something which governments around the world have still got to grapple with very, very hard. And we've seen in the UK the temptation to go on giving licenses in the North Sea. Well, that's a global trend. Every country in the world, every fossil fuel company in the world is still trying to expand its output of fossil fuels, despite the fact that they've already got far more kit than they need, than they can afford to use, if we're to keep temperatures within reasonable bounds.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's such a short term view, and I understand people think they're only going to be around for lifetime. So what does it matter to me? But I think that's just really selfish. So building businesses for financial extraction is not. I don't. I understand that that's what some people want to do, but there is with the renewable energy, it just makes sense. You're not going to have to use all of that equipment, and yes, it will go to waste. I'm sure we can recycle it in some way or form, but renewable, the clues in the title. You will constantly make money out of that.
Well, absolutely. And if one looks at the newspapers and one reads what the big fossil fuel companies like Shell and BP are saying, you can see that they're engaged in a balancing act. They know that they're going to have to shift ultimately to renewables, and they're sort of putting in place some of the companies that will enable that shift to happen. But while they're making so much money out of fossil fuels, they feel they don't have any alternative, and their shareholders also push them to continue to make all that money out of fossil fuels, which is why I'm a firm believer in windfall taxes and those kinds of things, because that takes the money away from those companies while they are continuing to make money out of fossil fuels and gives them a further incentive to shift much more quickly to renewables, where they can still make money, but they don't make as much money. So they're probably making 5 to 7% on renewables, whereas they're making 10 to 20% on fossil fuel extraction. And so that is the big problem.
It always comes back to money. It upsets me slightly. These are all massive changes, and they are good, and you paint a picture of a positive outlook. But what can we as individuals do to demand this change? How can we make change happen? How can we contribute?
Well, as citizens, first of all, by making sure that our politicians understand that we really rate these issues, we're prepared to vote according to these issues. And at the moment, that's not happening anything like strongly enough. Um, when I talk to members of parliament, which I do every now and again, they don't get a lot of pressure from their constituents to give these
Really?
issues. Oh, still not. They say, no one writes to me about this stuff. And partly that's because I think citizens expect them to understand the seriousness of the situation and expect them to do this on their own, because this is, a big global issue. Whereas most times when people write to their MPs, it's about potholes and local issues which they're concerned about. Um, but MPs need to recognise that this is really important to people, which is why I'm so encouraged by the recent London mayoral election, because that was absolutely fought on environmental issues, both clean air and climate change. The incumbent mayor was saying they're important and that's what I want to do. And he'd introduced the ultra low emission zone, which was very controversial for some drivers. And the Conservative candidate was saying they were going to rip it all out and they were not going to do any of this stuff. And she lost. She lost heavily. And so the incumbent was re-elected. And that's absolutely the message that we need to send to our politicians, that we think this stuff is really important and it's going to affect the way we vote, because ultimately that's all they care about.
So what about the people that are quite apathetic to voting and don't think it makes a difference? What can they do?
Well, I mean, firstly, they're wrong. That's the first thing to be said about it, that having a vote and living in a democracy is one of the most fantastic innovations that humans have managed to devise. And we only need to look at countries around the world that are not democracies in order to recognize that although the vote seems pretty boring and we're only one of millions and our vote doesn't seem to make much difference, actually it's absolutely critical for the whole sort of society in which we live. But if you're determined not to vote, well, then basically all you can do is what your individual life, if you want to make a difference to these issues, what you can do with your individual life, what you eat, how you travel, where you travel, and what energy source you use. And that's hard work. It can be made much easier work if our politicians will help us do that. But just doing it all by yourself, some people like it and they do it, but not enough of us. And if we're to make the progress that we need to make, we need to get the policy changes too.
Brilliant. Well, I think that is a wonderful way to round off the podcast. So thank you so much for joining me here today, Paul. That's been a thrilling discussion about going right from the individual level back to the macro and back to what we can do to try and make change in our everyday lives. So thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Green Truth podcast. We hope you found our discussion enlightening and inspiring. Remember, it's through understanding truth and action that we can pave the way for a sustainable future. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking conversations and don't forget to leave us a review. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.